David Clarke has spent his life fighting against a system that's always tried to box him in. But when the FBI sends him undercover to take down a criminal network exploiting young artists, he discovers a world far darker than anything he's ever faced, one where trust is a currency, and betrayal is the cost of survival. As he gets closer to exposing the ringleaders, he faces a new challenge: protecting Maya, a rising star who is being manipulated by the very people he's hunting. And the deeper he goes, the harder it becomes to keep his mission and his heart separate. But when the truth finally comes out, whose life will be shattered? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. David Clarke stared at the file in front of him, the fluorescent lights of the FBI briefing room casting harsh shadows on his face. His fingers drummed against the polished surface of the table, a rhythm born out of years of anxiety, anticipation mixed with the uncertainty that always came with the job. It was just another mission. Another undercover assignment. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. But as David flipped through the dossier, he felt the familiar pit in his stomach tighten. This was no ordinary case. The file detailed a network of high-profile individuals in the music industry, executives, agents, and managers who had built an empire on the backs of young, talented artists. They were exploiting their dreams, siphoning their earnings, and discarding them when they no longer served their purpose. It was modern-day exploitation disguised as opportunity, and David's job was to infiltrate this world and bring them down. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing as he absorbed the details. His new identity, David Reese, an up-and-coming music producer with a sharp ear for fresh talent. He would be expected to move through the glittering, fast-paced world of record labels and recording studios, the industry's smoke and mirrors. But beneath the glamour, there was a darkness. Young artists, particularly those from minority communities, were being preyed upon, manipulated into contracts that bled them dry. And behind it all were powerful, untouchable people who controlled the system. David closed the file, his jaw clenched. This mission hit too close to home. As a black man, he knew what it meant to be judged, underestimated, and marginalized. He had faced discrimination his entire life, both in the streets where he grew up and in the very institution he now worked for. Even within the FBI, where his track record spoke for itself, he had never quite shaken the sense that he was being watched, evaluated not just for his abilities, but for his race. He was the agent they sent in when the situation demanded a certain kind of person, someone who could blend into environments his white colleagues wouldn't fit into. But David was tired of being the one who had to fit in. He was tired of carrying the weight of other people's assumptions. Yet, here he was again, being asked to play a part, a role designed to exploit the very stereotypes he had spent his life pushing against. "You'll blend in," his boss had said when handing him the file. The words felt like a punch to the gut. He wasn't a chameleon. He was an agent, a damn good one. But blending in was part of the job, and that's what made him invaluable. He had been handpicked for this assignment, not because of his experience in law enforcement, though that played a part, but because he looked like someone who belonged in the world they were targeting. His boss hadn't said it outright, but David could read between the lines. They needed someone black, someone who wouldn't raise suspicion when walking through the doors of record labels and nightclubs filled with artists of color. It wasn't the first time David had been chosen for an assignment based on his appearance, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, the stakes felt higher. David's thoughts drifted back to his mother, a fierce civil rights activist who had spent her life fighting for racial equality. She had raised him to be proud of who he was, to never let the world define him by the color of his skin. But she had also warned him that being black in America came with a responsibility, one that meant standing up, even when the odds were against you. He had taken those lessons to heart, carrying them with him into every case he worked. Now, more than ever, those lessons resonated. This wasn't just about catching criminals, it was about something much bigger. It was about justice. Not just for the victims of this particular case, but for everyone who had ever been used and discarded by a system that profited from their oppression. David looked at his watch. The first step was simple. Blend in. He would need to immerse himself in the industry, become David Reese, the music producer. That meant attending parties, making connections, and winning the trust of people who were likely involved in illegal activities. He had done undercover work before, but this time felt different. This time, he wasn't just battling the criminals, he was battling the system itself. He stood up, tucking the file under his arm. As he walked toward the door, his phone buzzed. It was his boss, reminding him of the briefing tomorrow morning. David didn't need the reminder. He was ready, at least as ready as anyone could be when walking into a lion's den. Before leaving, David paused by the window, looking out over the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the buildings. He thought of the young artists who had moved to this city with dreams of making it big, only to find themselves trapped in contracts that stripped them of their freedom and creativity. How many of them had been discarded once they no longer served the interests of the powerful men who ran the industry? He had seen this story before, in different forms. Exploitation didn't care what industry you worked in. It thrived in the boardrooms of corporate America, the halls of government, and now, it seemed, in the recording studios of the music business. But this time, David wasn't going to let it slide. He had a mission. And if there was one thing he was known for, it was finishing what he started. His mind flicked back to the briefing he'd had earlier. The criminals at the top of this racket weren't just powerful, they were untouchable. Or at least, that's what they thought. The operation had been going on for years, with artists too scared or too broken to speak out. The system was airtight, and the people running it were masters of manipulation. They could ruin a career with a single phone call, blackball an artist with a whisper, or lock someone into a contract so tight they couldn't breathe. But David wasn't here to be manipulated. He was here to bring them down. He knew the risks, knew that he was stepping into a world where one misstep could get him compromised, or worse. But he was ready. He had spent his whole life fighting against the odds, and this mission was no different. David left the building, the cool night air hitting his face as he walked toward his car. He drove home in silence, his mind racing. He had no illusions about how difficult this assignment would be. The entertainment industry was built on appearance, and he would have to convince everyone around him that he was someone he wasn't. But as he pulled into his driveway and sat for a moment in the dark, he reminded himself of the one thing that grounded him. Justice wasn't always about making the arrest. Sometimes it was about making sure the people who needed help the most had a chance to rebuild their lives. And if that meant playing the role of David Reese, the music producer, for a while longer, then so be it. He grabbed the file from the passenger seat, a sense of determination washing over him. Tomorrow, the mission would begin in earnest. He would step into a world of wealth and glamour, where dreams were bought and sold. But beneath the glitz, he knew the truth. People like Maya, the young artists caught in this trap, needed someone to fight for them. And David Clarke was ready for the fight. David Clarke, now fully immersed in his new identity as David Reese, stood in the corner of an upscale exclusive event that had drawn some of the biggest names in the music industry. The sprawling mansion was bathed in gold light, with chandeliers hanging from the ceilings like intricate sculptures of opulence. Industry insiders, producers, agents, and a few celebrities mingled effortlessly, their laughter and chatter blending with the music that pulsed throughout the space. This was the epicenter of the entertainment world, a world David had only glimpsed from the outside. Now he was supposed to belong to it. He sipped his drink, watching the room with a practiced eye. It wasn't the lavishness of the event that struck him. He'd been around wealth and power before in other assignments. What unnerved him was the sharp contrast between what he saw and what he knew. On the surface, this world seemed glamorous, seductive even. But underneath, David knew it was full of hidden dangers, manipulations, and exploitations. His mission was to identify the key players who were running an underground racket that preyed on young, talented musicians. But these criminals didn't operate like street-level thugs. No, they were much more sophisticated. They wore tailored suits and held contracts that shackled artists to years of servitude under the guise of opportunity. The artists were lured by dreams of stardom. But those dreams often turned into nightmares, as they were drained dry and then discarded. David's eyes scanned the room. He had studied the faces before attending tonight's event, familiarizing himself with who was who. The ringleaders, the people he was really after, weren't here tonight, but their associates were. David knew he had to be patient. The first step was always to establish trust. He needed to make contacts, get close to the artists and the managers, and gradually build his way up the chain of power. But every move he made would be under scrutiny. It was then that he noticed her. Maya Daniels. She stood out from the crowd, not just because of her striking presence, but because she wasn't trying to be like everyone else in the room. While most of the attendees wore designer clothes and exuded an air of superiority, Maya looked almost understated. Her curly hair framed her face naturally, her makeup subtle but radiant, and her eyes held a fierce determination that immediately intrigued David. Maya was a rising star, a talented singer-songwriter who had burst onto the scene with a voice that was as raw as it was powerful. She had gained attention not just for her music, but for the stories she told through her lyrics, stories of struggle, resilience, and hope. David had listened to her work while preparing for this mission, and it had hit him in a way he hadn't expected. There was something deeply personal about her songs, something that spoke to the experiences of people who had been marginalized, overlooked, and misunderstood. People like him. But tonight, Maya didn't seem to carry the confidence her music exuded. She looked tense, almost wary, as she moved through the crowd. Her manager, a tall, sharp-dressed man named Greg Taylor, hovered near her, talking with a few label executives. Greg was one of the key figures in the criminal network David was investigating. He was charming, well-connected, and had a reputation for being able to turn unknowns into superstars overnight. But David knew the darker side of Greg's success. Greg didn't just promote artists, he owned them. He controlled their careers, their money, their image. And if they didn't play by his rules, they found themselves blacklisted, their careers over before they'd even begun. David needed to get closer to Greg. But more than that, he needed to get closer to Maya. She was his way in. Taking a deep breath, David crossed the room, making his way toward Maya. As he approached, Greg glanced his way, his eyes flickering with a hint of suspicion before offering a smile. "David Reese, right?" Greg said, extending a hand. "I've heard about you, the new producer everyone's talking about." David shook his hand, keeping his smile casual. "I've been fortunate to work with some talented artists lately." Greg nodded, but his eyes were already moving on. He wasn't interested in small talk. "Maya, this is David," he said, turning to the young artist. "He's been making waves in the production scene." Maya glanced at David, her expression guarded. "Nice to meet you," she said, her voice polite but distant. "Likewise," David replied, his voice calm. "I've been following your music for a while. I think you've got something special." Maya gave a small, non-committal nod, but David could tell she wasn't particularly interested in hearing another producer's opinion about her work. She had probably heard it all before, from countless people who only saw her as a product to be shaped and sold. But David wasn't like the others. He wasn't here to exploit her talent. He was here to help her, even if she didn't know it yet. Still, he couldn't push too hard too fast. Trust, especially in this world, had to be earned. "Maybe we can collaborate sometime," David added, his tone light. "I'd love to hear more about what inspires your writing." Maya raised an eyebrow, as if weighing whether he was just another smooth talker trying to get a piece of her success. "We'll see," she said, her voice cool. "I'm pretty selective about who I work with." David smiled, appreciating her cautiousness. "I respect that," he said. "I'll let you get back to it, but if you ever want to talk music, I'm around." As he stepped away, David could feel Greg's eyes on him. He knew he had planted a seed, but it would take time to grow. For now, he had made contact, and that was enough. Maya was someone he couldn't afford to lose sight of. She was too important, both to his mission and to the people who were exploiting her. For the rest of the night, David mingled with the crowd, listening, observing, and taking mental notes. He chatted with other producers, managers, and artists, all the while maintaining the persona of a rising producer looking for his next big break. But beneath the surface, his mind was constantly working. analyzing the power dynamics, the connections, the people who pulled the strings. As the event wound down, David left the mansion with a heavy heart. He had entered a world where talent and dreams were currency, and where the powerful used that currency to enrich themselves at the expense of the vulnerable. He had met Maya, the young artist whose future hung in the balance, and he had seen the forces at play that were working to control her. In the days that followed, David kept a low profile, attending more industry events, visiting recording studios, and slowly building relationships with key figures. His name began to circulate, and soon, people were calling him for meetings, offering him opportunities to work with new artists. But his focus remained on Maya. He watched from the sidelines as Greg Taylor and the other members of his team tightened their grip on her, pushing her to conform to their vision of who she should be. David could see the cracks starting to form. Maya's music, once raw and authentic, was being molded into something more commercial, more palatable for mass consumption. Her lyrics were being watered down, her image curated for maximum marketability. And while Maya put on a brave face, David could see the strain in her eyes, the frustration of being pulled in directions that didn't feel true to who she was. One night, after a long day of recording sessions, David saw Maya sitting alone in the studio, her head resting on her hands. The room was dimly lit, and the only sound was the soft hum of the equipment around her. David approached cautiously, not wanting to intrude. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Maya looked up, her expression tired but defiant. "Just trying to figure out how much of myself I'm willing to lose," she said. David sat down next to her, giving her space, but offering his presence. "I know it's not easy, but don't let them take away what makes you, you." Maya smiled bitterly. Easier said than done. David didn't push. He knew that the fight Maya was in wasn't just about music. It was about control, about who got to decide who she was and what she stood for. He wanted to help her, to show her that she didn't have to give in to the pressures around her. But for now, all he could do was be there, waiting for the moment when she was ready to take back her power. And when that moment came, David knew he would be there to help her fight. David Clarke had never been a stranger to deception. It came with the territory of being an undercover agent. But as he spent more time in the music industry adopting his role as David Reese, he found the lines between trust and lies growing blurrier with each passing day. His mission was simple: infiltrate, investigate, and bring down the criminal network exploiting young artists. But the human element, the emotions, the relationships, and the fragile trust he was building made things infinitely more complicated, especially with Maya. It had been a few weeks since their initial meeting, and David had managed to stay close without pushing too hard. He had attended her recording sessions, offered insights into her music, and gradually started earning her trust. But trust in this world was a delicate thing. It could be shattered with one wrong move. Maya was smart, cautious, and fiercely protective of her work. She had to be. She had come from nothing, and now she was fighting to hold on to everything she had built. And though she was surrounded by people who claimed to have her best interests at heart, David knew that many of them were using her as a pawn in a much larger game. David sat in a plush chair at a high-end recording studio, watching as Maya laid down vocal tracks for her latest song. The song was beautiful, raw, emotional, and full of the kind of vulnerability that made people connect with her on a deep level. But David could see the strain in her. Every time she emerged from the recording booth, her expression was a mix of frustration and resignation. "You're pushing too hard," David said gently as she took a seat beside him during a break. Maya rubbed her temples, looking exhausted. "I don't have a choice," she muttered. "They want it done by the end of the week, and I'm running on fumes." "They?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. "My manager, the label, everyone," she replied with a sigh. "They're all telling me what I need to do to stay relevant. I'm trying to stay true to myself, but every time I push back, it's like I'm being told I don't know what's best for me." David could hear the bitterness in her voice. She was beginning to feel the weight of being controlled, of having her creativity molded by people who saw her as a product rather than an artist. He knew how this played out. He had seen it time and time again. Artists like Maya, full of passion and talent, would get pulled into the machine, chewed up, and spit out when they no longer fit the mold. "Do you believe them?" David asked, his voice low and calm. "Do you really think they know what's best for you?" Maya was silent for a moment, her gaze distant. "I don't know," she admitted. "I used to think I knew who I was, what I wanted, but now it's like I don't even recognize myself anymore." David's heart ached for her. He had to remind himself that this was part of the mission. Getting close to Maya, understanding her struggles, and earning her trust was all part of the plan. But the more time he spent with her, the more he realized how personal this had become. It wasn't just about bringing down the criminal organization anymore. It was about protecting her. And that scared him. "I can't tell you what to do," David said carefully. "But I can tell you this. Don't let anyone take away what makes you, you. Your voice, your story. It's yours. They don't get to define that." Maya looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something. For what? David wasn't sure. Reassurance, maybe. Or perhaps she was just trying to gauge if he really meant what he said. In this world, sincerity was a rare commodity. "I want to believe that," she said softly. "But sometimes it feels like, no matter how hard I fight, I'm always losing." David wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to tell her about Greg Taylor, her manager, and his ties to the criminal network. He wanted to warn her about the people who were pulling the strings behind the scenes. But he couldn't. Not yet. His investigation was still in its early stages, and revealing too much too soon could compromise everything. So he swallowed the truth, pushing it down where it wouldn't surface. "They'll push you as far as they can," David said, choosing his words carefully. "But at the end of the day, it's your name on the record, not theirs." Maya nodded, but the doubt in her eyes lingered. She was torn between the pressure to conform and the desire to stay true to herself. David knew that feeling all too well. He had spent his life walking that tightrope, balancing between the expectations placed on him as a black man in a predominantly white institution like the FBI and his own sense of integrity. Just then, Greg Taylor entered the studio, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. He was all charm and confidence, his designer suit perfectly tailored, his smile smooth and rehearsed. David watched him closely, every instinct on high alert. Greg was one of the key players in the criminal network David was investigating, and yet here he was, acting like Maya's biggest supporter. "Hey, superstar," Greg greeted Maya with a wide grin. "How's it going? Are we getting that magic down today?" Maya forced a smile. "We're getting there." David didn't miss the flicker of discomfort in her eyes. She was starting to feel the suffocating grip Greg had on her career, even if she wasn't fully aware of it yet. Greg's attention shifted to David. "David Reese," he said smoothly, extending a hand. "I hear you've been hanging around quite a bit lately. Maya's lucky to have a producer like you taking an interest." David shook his hand, keeping his expression neutral. "Just here to help where I can." Greg's smile never wavered, but David could sense the underlying tension. Greg was always sizing people up, assessing their usefulness. And right now, David was just another piece on the chessboard. "Well, I hope you're not filling her head with too many wild ideas," Greg said with a chuckle. "The label's got big plans for her, and we need to make sure we're all on the same page." David felt a surge of anger but kept it hidden behind a polite smile. Greg was trying to assert control, to remind everyone, especially Maya, who was really in charge. It was subtle, but it was there. A veiled warning. "I'm just here to support her vision," David said calmly. "She's the one with the talent." Greg's smile tightened just a fraction. "That's right, and with the right guidance, we're going to take her career to the next level. It's all about trust, you know?" David held Greg's gaze, the unspoken challenge between them thickening the air. Trust. That word had a way of taking on different meanings in this business. For Greg, trust meant control. For David, it meant something far more fragile and elusive. After a few moments, Greg turned back to Maya. "I've got a meeting to run to, but keep me posted on the progress. We've got deadlines to hit." With that, Greg swept out of the studio, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Maya exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," she murmured. David's heart went out to her, but he couldn't reveal his hand yet. He had to be careful, precise. Every step he took had to be calculated. One wrong move, and the whole operation could collapse, leaving not just Maya, but countless other artists, trapped in the same exploitative system. But David's patience was wearing thin. He hated watching Maya suffer, hated seeing her spirit slowly eroded by people who only saw her as a commodity. He had always been able to keep his emotions in check during undercover assignments, but this time it was different. Maya wasn't just another target. She was someone worth fighting for. And that terrified him. David Clarke stood in the dimly lit hallway outside the recording studio, listening to the faint echo of Maya's voice drifting through the air. The session was running late, as it often did, with Maya pushing herself to perfect every note, every lyric. David admired her dedication, but he also knew the strain it was putting on her. Over the past few weeks, he had seen the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped a little more with each passing day. She was fighting a losing battle against forces far greater than she realized. And the worst part was, she didn't fully understand who she was fighting against. The world Maya had stepped into wasn't just about music, it was about power. Who held it, who wielded it, and who was willing to do whatever it took to maintain it. And in this world, people like Maya, with all their talent and dreams, were often the first to be sacrificed. David had seen it before. He had watched as bright, promising careers were snuffed out by manipulative managers and greedy executives. The system was designed to chew people up and spit them out, and Maya was teetering on the edge of that abyss. He couldn't let that happen. But the deeper he got into his role as David Reese, the music producer, the harder it became to separate his mission from his emotions. He was getting too close, caring too much. Maya had become more than just a pawn in the investigation. She was someone he wanted to protect, someone he wanted to save. But in the world of undercover work, emotions were dangerous. They clouded judgment, made you vulnerable, and left you exposed. And yet here he was, standing in the middle of a storm of his own making. David's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the quiet of the hallway. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from his handler, a simple reminder of the stakes. We need more evidence. Time's running out. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and David felt the familiar weight of the mission settle on his shoulders. They were right. Time was running out. The FBI needed concrete evidence to take down Greg Taylor and the other members of the criminal network, and David was the only one in a position to gather it. But the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous the game became. Greg wasn't a fool. He had been running this operation for years, and his instincts were sharp. If he even suspected that David was more than just a producer, the whole operation would come crashing down. And with it, Maya's chance at freedom. David pocketed his phone and took a deep breath, pushing open the door to the studio. Inside, Maya was seated at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys as she stared blankly at the sheet music in front of her. She looked lost, like a sailor adrift in an endless sea, searching for a shore that was just out of reach. "Maya," David said softly, walking over to her. "You've been at this for hours. Maybe it's time to take a break." Maya glanced up at him, her eyes tired but determined. "I can't," she replied, her voice strained. "I have to get this right. If I don't, Greg's going to pull the track." David sighed, pulling up a chair next to her. "You can't keep letting him dictate everything you do. This is your music, your voice. You should be the one deciding when it's right." Maya looked down at the piano, her fingers absently pressing the keys. "I wish it were that simple," she whispered. "But it's not. Nothing about this is simple anymore." David leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. What happened to the girl who didn't care what anyone thought? The one who wrote songs because she had something to say, not because someone told her how to say it? Maya laughed bitterly. She got lost somewhere along the way. David felt a pang of sadness as he listened to her. Maya had come into the industry with so much fire, so much passion. But now, that fire was flickering, barely hanging on. Greg and the label had been systematically extinguishing it, piece by piece, until all that was left was a hollow shell of the artist she once was. And the worst part was, Maya was starting to believe that this was her only option, that this was the price she had to pay for success. "I think she's still in there," David said gently. "You just need to find her again." Maya didn't respond, but the look in her eyes told him that his words had hit home. She was at a crossroads, standing between the version of herself she had always dreamed of being and the version the industry was trying to force her into. And the path she chose now would define the rest of her career. Before David could say anything else, the door to the studio swung open and Greg Taylor walked in, his presence immediately commanding the room. He was smiling, but there was a tightness to his expression that David had come to recognize as a warning sign. Greg was feeling the pressure too. The label had been pushing for more control over Maya's career, and Greg had been doing everything in his power to keep her in line. But David could see the cracks starting to form. "How's it going in here?" Greg asked, his voice light but with an undercurrent of tension. "Making progress, I hope." Maya forced a smile. "We're getting there," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Greg's eyes flicked to David, and for a moment the two men exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Greg didn't trust David. Not completely. He tolerated him because David had proven to be useful, but there was always an air of suspicion in Greg's interactions with him, a sense that he was constantly evaluating whether David was a threat. And in a way, he was right to be wary. "Good," Greg said, his gaze lingering on David for a second longer before turning back to Maya. "The label's been asking about the new tracks. They want something by the end of the week." Maya's expression tightened, and David could see the stress etched into every line of her face. She was being pulled in too many directions, and Greg was only adding to the pressure. "I'll get it done," Maya said quietly. Greg smiled, but there was something predatory about it. "I know you will. You always do." David watched the exchange, his stomach twisting with a mix of anger and frustration. Greg was manipulating her, using her need for approval and success to keep her in line. It was a game of power, and Maya was the pawn. As Greg left the studio, David leaned forward, his voice low. "You don't have to do this, Maya. You don't have to let him control everything." Maya looked at him, and for a moment, David saw the vulnerability behind her tough exterior. "What choice do I have?" she asked. "If I don't do what they want, they'll destroy me, they'll blacklist me, I'll be done." David shook his head. "That's not true. You're talented. You have something special. You don't need them as much as they want you to believe you do." Maya's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "It's not that simple. You don't understand how this world works." David wanted to tell her that he understood more than she realized. He wanted to tell her about the investigation, about Greg's involvement in the criminal network that was exploiting artists like her. But he couldn't? Not yet. The time wasn't right. Instead, he reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Maya. Don't let them break you." For a moment, Maya just stared at him, her eyes searching his. Then she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough. It was a glimmer of hope, a sign that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to see that she didn't have to keep playing by their rules. But David knew that time was running out. The FBI was closing in on Greg and his associates, and soon, the entire operation would come to light. When that happened, Maya would be caught in the middle. And David wasn't sure if she would be able to handle the fallout. The unraveling had begun, and there was no turning back now. David Clarke stood at the crossroads of his mission and his heart. The walls were closing in. He had spent months undercover, meticulously gathering evidence against Greg Taylor and the criminal network that had been exploiting young artists like Maya. He had kept his emotions in check, played his role as David Reese, the up-and-coming music producer, and built the trust he needed to get close to the people pulling the strings. But now, as the operation was nearing its end, David knew the hardest part was still ahead. The truth was about to come out, and with it, the inevitable fallout. For Maya, the realization would be devastating. She had grown to trust him, confide in him, and rely on him as an ally in an industry that seemed hell-bent on controlling her every move. She didn't know that David wasn't just a producer. She didn't know that he was working for the FBI. And she certainly didn't know that Greg, her manager, the man she had once trusted to guide her career, was part of a vast, corrupt system that had been using her as a pawn. David was prepared for the arrests, the media frenzy, and the dismantling of Greg's operation. What he wasn't prepared for was the personal cost. He had never gotten this close to a target before, and now, as the truth loomed on the horizon, he found himself dreading the moment when he would have to reveal his real identity to Maya. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place just a few days earlier. David had intercepted a shipment of falsified contracts, binding agreements that locked artists into predatory deals with no way out. The contracts were the smoking gun the FBI needed to bring down the entire operation, but they also represented something far more personal for David. These documents weren't just about business, they were about lives. Young, talented artists who had been robbed of their freedom and creativity. David hadn't wanted to believe that Maya was one of them, but the evidence was undeniable. Greg had tied her up in the same web of manipulation and deceit as everyone else. The tracks she was being forced to record, the image she was being pressured to adopt, it was all part of a carefully crafted strategy to turn her into a product, a commodity that could be sold and discarded when she was no longer profitable. Now, standing outside the recording studio for what he knew would be the last time, David felt the weight of his deception pressing down on him. He had one final meeting with Maya before everything would come crashing down. Tomorrow, the FBI would move in, and Greg would be arrested along with several others involved in the scheme. Maya's world would implode, and David would be revealed for who he really was, an undercover agent who had been lying to her from the start. The door to the studio opened, and Maya stepped out, looking tired but focused. She had been working late into the night again, pushing herself harder than ever. Her new album was almost complete, but David knew that after tomorrow, nothing about her career or her life would ever be the same. "David," Maya said, her voice softer than usual. "You've been quiet lately. What's going on?" David swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. He had rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times, but now that it was here, the words seemed to escape him. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice strained. Maya frowned, her eyes searching his face. "You're scaring me. What's wrong?" David took a deep breath. "I haven't been completely honest with you, Maya, about who I am, about why I'm here." She crossed her arms, her expression wary. "What do you mean?" David's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. "I'm not a music producer," he said, the words coming out slowly, painfully. "I'm an FBI agent. I was sent here undercover to investigate Greg and the people he's been working with." Maya stared at him, her face frozen in shock. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence hung heavy between them, thick with confusion, betrayal, and disbelief. "You're what?" Maya finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. David looked at her, his chest tightening with guilt. "I've been investigating the network that's been exploiting artists like you. Greg is part of it. I'm sorry, Maya. I didn't want it to be this way, but it was the only way I could get close enough to take them down." Maya took a step back, shaking her head as if trying to make sense of what he was saying. "You've been lying to me this whole time?" "Everything. Our conversations, the music, the advice, it was all part of some investigation?" David wanted to reach out to her, to explain, but he knew that nothing he said would make this easier. "It wasn't all a lie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I meant what I said about your music, about you. You're incredibly talented and you don't need them to define who you are. But I couldn't tell you the truth until now. I'm sorry." Maya's face contorted with anger and pain. "You made me believe I could trust you," she said, her voice trembling. "You made me believe you cared about me." "I do care about you," David said urgently. "More than I should. That's why this is so hard. I didn't want you to get caught in the middle of this, but I had to do my job." Maya turned away, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to shield herself from the truth. "How could you do this?" she whispered. "How could you let me believe in something that was never real?" David's heart shattered at the sound of her voice. He had known this moment would be painful, but hearing the hurt in her words made it unbearable. He had deceived her, yes, but his feelings for her had been real. That was the cruel irony of it all. He had gotten too close, cared too much, and now Maya was the one paying the price. "Maya," he said softly, stepping closer to her. "Tomorrow, everything is going to change. Greg and the others, they're going to be arrested. You'll be free from them. You'll be able to make your own choices again, without their control." Maya shook her head, her voice choked with emotion. And what about you? What happens to us after tomorrow? David's throat tightened. He had asked himself that same question 100 times, and each time the answer had been the same. There was no future for them. Not after this. I don't know, he admitted. I wish I could tell you that things will be okay, but I don't know what's going to happen. Maya turned to face him, her eyes red with unshed tears. I trusted you, she whispered. And you lied to me. David felt the full weight of her words settle over him like a crushing blow. There was nothing he could say to make this right. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely audible. I never wanted to hurt you. Maya didn't respond. She simply looked at him for a long moment, her expression a mixture of sorrow and betrayal, before turning and walking away. David watched her go, knowing that he had just lost something precious, something he would never be able to get back. The next day came swiftly. The FBI moved in, and the arrests went off without a hitch. Greg and his associates were taken into custody, their criminal enterprise dismantled. The media buzzed with the news of the high-profile takedown, and the music industry was rocked by the revelations of corruption and exploitation. But for David, there was no sense of victory. He had done his job. Justice had been served. But the personal cost had been steep, and the damage to his relationship with Maya was irreparable. In the weeks that followed, Maya kept her distance. She withdrew from the public eye, taking time to reflect on everything that had happened. The contracts that had once bound her were now void, and she had regained control of her career. But the betrayal she felt lingered like a shadow, and David knew that it would take time, if ever, for her to heal. As for David, he returned to his work, though he was forever changed by the experience. He had seen the dark side of an industry that claimed to nurture talent but instead profited from exploitation. And he had learned the hard way that even when justice was served, the emotional fallout could leave scars that would never fully heal. The story ended not with triumph, but with the quiet, bittersweet reality that sometimes doing the right thing came at a price. And in the end, both David and Maya were left to grapple with the consequences of a world where trust was fragile, and the lines between right and wrong were never as clear as they seemed. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.